morning. It's Viewpoint, the program of personalities, politicians, and perspectives. We certainly have two of those. We'll leave out the politicians this morning and have a good morning. How are you, Mrs. Busby?
Well, better than the politicians, I can tell you that.
Oh, well, let's don't get on that soapbox. This is supposed to be a program of politicians.
I understand that the Congress has a 9% approval rating.
How'd they get that high?
I don't know. They must have gone to a totally out of the way place that had no news connections.
A lot of people running the ostrich syndrome. If they give them 1%, they've got an ostrich syndrome. Got their head in the sand. We always try to start Viewpoint, gentlemen, with a kudo or two. Today I'm going to limit it to one kudo. I picked up the newspaper the other day and I see Chester East School. They promoted a program and the headline on the column says, "Minding Their Manners." And you gentlemen probably read about this little gig they have out there at Chester East, wherein they had a little dinner, and they have the youngsters, boys and girls, dress up, and had a great picture of a couple of good-looking young folks here, all done up in their best bib and tucker. And the purpose of the evening, or the day was that we're going to tell them about how to do it right when they go out to the dinner table, among other things.
You know,
civilities and things like that.
This morning, early on the radio, they were talking about the whole business of saying thank you and how it makes you feel better if you say thank you. And I've noticed at my other job, when we've had many medical days and all the students come from all the area schools to see the hospital and tour the hospital, and we give them each a little bag with some little favors in it, and some say thank you and some don't. And I'd say the don'ts far outweigh. In the olden days, your grandma used to teach you how to set the table, how to sit at the table and chew with your mouth shut and behave. And I guess the grandmas are falling down on the job.
Well, there again, we have this great socioeconomic problem of working parents and single parents, and they don't have the opportunity to sit down at a table like quote normal things used to be way back in the archaic days. So they don't get the opportunity. And so hats off and kudos to Superintendent and Principal Jennifer Am out there, and to all who participated in that little business of teaching the youngsters something about minding your manners. So that's a great thing. I also like to mention that a roving reporter from La Crosse, Wisconsin, is back, and she'll be checking in, I guess, one of these days real soon. She's going to give us a report on the Suncoast Jazz Festival, which is the granddaddy of all jazz festivals down at Sarasota, Florida. The old guy and his bride were going to go to that. We decided we better cancel out for that. But, and Lou Snutt, our roving reporter from Surprise, Arizona, will be reporting in, too.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, well, all right. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, we probably should disclose, as we introduce our guest this morning, that I've known him for a long time. I've known Mr. Golwitzer since the first day his wife dragged him through the doors of the Episcopal Church screaming and kicking. And in the interest of really full disclosure, I'd have to say that I'm the godparent of the new grandfather, who is also with us today. So I'm going to let you introduce these gentlemen for us, Judith Kay.
Yeah, I've really been looking forward to your visit, fellows. What with tomorrow being Thanksgiving, there are an awful lot of people in this area who can include on their list of I'm thankful for the Woods Foundation. The good that it has done in such a broad spectrum of agencies that it has helped. I think it doesn't seem that a week goes by, but there's something else that they've helped happen. And both Dave Golwitzer and Bill Bates are on the board that administers this. Is it a trust? Is that what you'd call it?
It's actually a charitable foundation. It's a corporate entity as opposed to a trust, but it's a private foundation.
Bill and I are both anxious to hear about different angles on it. I'd like to have you tell us a little bit about the Woods family, and you've both known them had known them for a long time, hadn't you?
That's correct.
Yes, and Bill would like to hear about qualifications and so forth for applying to the Woods Foundation. Can we start with history, since I got to be the first one to talk?
Absolutely.
Listen, she owns 51% of the show, so we do it her way, boys.
And the losses.
That's right. That's right.
I'm anxious to hear. I've met them. They're both, of course, gone to heaven now, but I'd like to hear a little bit about them and how this came about.
Dave, you want me to field that?
Go right ahead, Bill.
Well, Robert J. Woods and Joanne Jarrett Woods were the founders of the Woods Foundation. Many people probably recall Bob Woods practiced law, and I had the privilege of being his partner from when I started in 1979 until Bob actually retired in the end of 1995. Mrs. Woods was active in the community, Judy, and many things you do. She was active with the hospital for a long time. Probably two of the most philanthropic people you would ever know, but most people didn't know that.
But quietly so.
Very quietly so. Everything they did while they were both living was done in large part anonymously, so very few people know how generous they were while they were alive. But Bob and Joe formed the Woods Foundation in 1998. They provided initial funding, and it came into existence in the early part of 1998. And the original board of directors of the Woods Foundation were Mr. and Mrs. Woods, were both directors, David Golwitzer and myself and Mike Abbott. And we started our work basically, which we exist as a charitable foundation to try and help other organizations. And the Woods Foundation has been going since that early part of, I don't think we probably got into the position where we were actually providing grants to other organizations until late 1998 or early 99. But we've been doing that since. We've obviously had a change in the board of directors through the passing of both Mr. and Mrs. Woods. Mrs. Woods was very active in the foundation until about 2004 or 5. She passed away in December of 06. But we, in the early days, had all of our board meetings at her home out on Nicholson Road in Lincoln, and she'd host us for lunch, and we would meet there and go about our business of the foundation. And really the foundation exists to preserve the assets that they provided to the foundation and then see what good work and help we can do to other organizations with the funds that they've made available. So their philanthropy will continue in perpetuity.
Would it be out of line to ask if you can disclose some of their personal philanthropic deeds?
Well, I think generally most of their philanthropic things were on a local level. They were very fond of the hospital in Lincoln.
And have done so much for the new hospital.
They have. They did, and Mrs. Woods was very generous in her estate at the time of her death to the hospital and gave the capital campaign for the new hospital a real boost from the get-go. And they were fond of the colleges in Lincoln, both Lincoln Christian College and Lincoln College, and other things, their church. They were just very active and very generous.
Is it permissible to review some of the folks, some of those who have received help from this foundation? I mean, it's really kind of a long list, gentlemen, that have been on the receiving end of this philanthropic effort.
Bill, all the gifts that we've, or all the grants that we've made out of the foundation are really public record.
That's what, yes.
And so it's true. There's nothing secret. And as was stated, the breadth of the contribution, the money that has been granted is just amazing. We get grant requests from all kinds of organizations, and frankly, a good proportion of them are not granted. Just because of the philosophy of the board or how we're going about this process, and we'll probably get into that a little bit later. But you mentioned the low-key gifts that the Woods would make. for the first few years and up until Mrs. Wood's death, everything we did was kept confidential. It
Yes,
still
that's what I
was.
understood.
That was one of the grant request conditions. When we would give an organization something, we'd say, "And you're not to publicize this," because Mrs. Woods just was very humble and didn't want that information out there. And we've set about as a mission since her death that we're going to correct and right that wrong. Everybody needs to know the extent of their contribution to the community and what they've done and what they've set up for, as Bill said, for perpetuity.
Well, it's certainly safe to say that they had absolutely no intention of any personal aggrandizement whatsoever in helping various organizations. That's the last very thing in mind that they would ever have. So I can understand their need to, at that time, to keep it confidential. But as you so rightly point out, now it's time to let people know the good, and my goodness gracious, organization after organization have received help. Now, just because you have a good idea and you're president of organization A, that doesn't necessarily mean that, and you do good in the community and so forth, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're an automatic recipient of your request. You have some guidelines that you have to follow, and so let's say organization A wants to make an application. What are the guidelines, William?
Well, there's probably two levels of there's guidelines that we as a foundation board of directors try to establish to carry out the intentions of Mr. and Mrs. Woods. We try to always keep in mind when evaluating grant applications, is this the type of thing they wanted to support? Is this the type of thing they were interested in perpetuating? And that's the personal guidelines of the foundation and the board of directors. We do, however, have a set of legal rules that does, in fact, come into play quite often. Over the course of the foundation, we've probably had requests from people individually or businesses individually that may be very worthwhile and might very well meet the guidelines of the foundation board of directors that we've established, but the legalities aren't there. We're governed by the Internal Revenue Code as a private foundation, and we are entitled to make grants to organizations that are classified under the Internal Revenue Code under Section 501c3.
Okay.
And that's a charitable status that's established by an organization. And then the reason for their status is further classified under Internal Revenue Code Section 509A. And there's 509A1, 509A2, and 509A3 organizations. So they not only have to, before we can even consider giving them money, they have to be classified 501c3. We then have to look another step because of some regulations adopted in the last 2 years, and we have to determine if they're under 509A1, 2, or 3. We as a Woods Foundation have chosen as a matter of policy not to make grants to organizations that are classified under 509A3 because that is what's called a supporting organization, and that imposes very strict oversight responsibilities on us as a Woods Foundation to oversee how they expend and use the money that we've given to them, and we simply don't have the manpower and the resources to do that oversight once we give them the money. So in other words, oversight means we give them the money and then we have to follow it. We have to find out that they did what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to do it. So our giving is restricted to 501c3 organizations that are classified under either 509A1 or 509A2. And you say, how do we know that? I mean, if somebody's out there and they want to apply for a grant, how do they know that? Well, they would have an exemption letter from the Internal Revenue Service. And that exemptions letter will say if they're a 501c3 entity. And most exemption letters also then say if they're classified under 509A1, 2, or 3. So to the extent they don't meet those requirements legally, we cannot give them money. And there's been organizations, there's a lot of local organizations that operate on a very informal basis. We know who, we run into them every day.
Sure.
And it would be a very worthwhile thing to support, but we simply can't legally
Your
give
hands
them
are
money.
tied.
So we fall under those requirements.
Do those laws, the foundations under, or the qualifications under 501c3, do they go further in helping keep the money where it's supposed to go, or do they go further in hampering you and solidifying the need for an attorney at all times to read all that?
You're the attorney.
Well, most organizations, if they haven't taken the steps to be a 501c3, it is a bit cumbersome. The last time I looked, the application form that you have to file with the IRS is Form 1023, and I think the last I knew it was about 27 pages long. And that initial task of any organization seeking to have exempt status is relatively complicated. And it's not something that a lot of people would want to tackle. But does it hamper us? Not particularly, because we know definitively what organizations we can provide funding to and which we can't. And I should add, in addition to 501c3 organizations, we can give funds to governmental entities and schools. Because not all schools, public municipal governments or governmental entities and schools aren't 501c3s, but they do fall within the guidelines of the IRS that are qualified entities we can provide grant funds to.
Now, you have also, go ahead, David, you were going to comment.
Well, I was going to comment that when we get a grant application, if they're not a 501c3, we will actually look at that grant application and say, is this from an organization that does have an umbrella group available to it that they're not taking advantage of? An example would be, we'll get a grant application from a classroom teacher, and we might think it's valid, something we'd like to pursue. Well, we'll go back to them and say, if you go through your school board, we can make this grant if your school board will make the application and commit to spend the funds in the fashion that applicant wanted it to go. And so we look to try to accommodate the rules, which we have to do, but we look to try to accommodate the applicant also.
By golly, this board isn't just meeting for tea and crumpets every month, is it?
Not usually.
It's a big job.
It's an important job, and it's a very rewarding job.
Oh, undoubtedly.
Judy, you raise a good point, because the Internal Revenue Code outlines what we can and we can't do, but then it puts the burden on us as directors to do what is classified as due diligence. When we get an application, we have to do this investigation on our end to make sure they are a qualified recipient, because if we don't do it and we make a grant to a non-qualifying organization, there's penalties assessed against our foundation, which in turn, any foundation penalties that are paid come back to us personally. If we don't follow the due diligence requirements and improperly make a grant to a non-qualifying entity, the IRS or the Illinois Attorney General are going to come knocking on our door and say, pony up the money that you shouldn't have paid.
And that's from your wallet.
That's from our wallet.
You could be held personally responsible for that.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So we have to follow the rules.
One of your modus operandi is I believe it's correct, that sometimes that you will go to matching grants. If an organization raise X number of dollars, then you will match that. Is that correct? Not in all instances, but in several instances that's taken place. Is that correct?
And that's very correct, Bill. And that's an extremely productive way to expand the usefulness of the grant.
Sure.
And somebody comes to us and says, we need $10,000, and we say, do you have supporters out there that could assist you? And if we give you an incentive to do that, can you solicit those supporters and have a better chance of accomplishing your goals? And so that's why that comes into play. It's not always available, but it's very, very productive when it is available.
In fact, didn't that come into play with the Oasis dire need for a van?
It was perfect. Just the perfect example of use of that.
And they stepped to the plate and got so far on base, and then you brought them home in a big way. In a big way, really. And not only that, but you kind of upped the ante a little bit for them at the end of it when
we
it was all said and done.
We have the ability to do that because, Phil, we're not just limited to what you ask for. You may come to us with a grant request, and we may manipulate that. We may say, okay, we really want to know what you're trying to accomplish. It's not just the dollars you're asking for. what we're really after is what are you trying to accomplish, and then we look for some methodology to help you accomplish that goal. If it's number one, if it's an organization we're trying to support, and that was the case with the Oasis. They had the goal that we wanted to support them in accomplishing, and they just did a wonderful job of taking that to the community. I mean, far beyond anybody's expectations. It was just incredible. So we rechanneled our grant a little bit and said, you've done such a wonderful job of raising the money for this acquisition. We will still expand that and give you money for repair and replacement of that vehicle.
Now,
and so that really was the more of an accomplishment of their longer-term goal, was to how to keep that thing going, not just get the initial purchase.
That's kind of back to your being Dick Tracy, isn't it? And doing all this investigation, right?
Yes, a little bit.
A little bit. We try to work with our grant requesters and accomplish their goals as best we can. And the challenge grant, the Oasis is the best example we can give, because the community stepped up and was very generous to the Oasis. And if you look at it from the perspective of supporters, let's just say Bill Gossett is supportive of the Oasis. If he knows if he gives them $1, they're guaranteed to get $2, because they're going to get his $1 plus one from the Woods Foundation. It taps the otherwise potentially dormant donors of that organization and encourages them to participate. So it gets more of the community involved. We don't want to be a life ring to an organization. We want to trump up their support as best we can. So on a local level, the challenge grants have worked very well in a lot of cases.
And we've seen that this is truly a giving community.
Yes, it is.
Day in and day out, somebody seems just to grab a bat, step to the plate. It's really rather intriguing. I've been the question that I really wanted to ask about: did Bob and Joanne limit this to a geographic area, keep it right in Lincoln-Golden County, in which I would assume that we would? But is there any regulation that would prevent anybody else from making an application?
No, there is no geographical limitation on the foundation. We do in fact get grant applications from across the state and across the country.
Really?
Yes.
Now,
yes.
I wouldn't have thought that.
Yes.
That's very interesting.
Do you happen to give preference to something that's closer to home, or not necessarily?
We try to help the community at large as much as we can. Yes. Yes.
And that, but you say the community at large, and I'm glad you brought that up, because it isn't just Lincoln's geographic area to the city limits, right?
It is not by any means. No,
we don't even consider that.
We look more, I would say more regionally. Central Illinois actually is our biggest emphasis. We have one of the organizations we've tried to support for quite some time, back even to when Mrs. Woods was making site visits with us. And I mentioned site visits. That's another thing sometimes we get into, where if we have a particular grant, we need to go to that location. A perfect example is Timber Point up on Lake Bloomington. Easter Seals, isn't it? Easter Seals Timber Point. And the foundation is tried to help that organization because they do so much good throughout central Illinois. And,
that's very revealing.
There's a lot of there's new facilities there we participated in, and one of the greatest rewarding things was having Mrs. Woods go see these things with us.
Oh yeah, oh I'm sure.
So
and I bet it just pleased her ever so to see something like this Timber Point grow up.
It did.
And it has grown up. That's a very good term. You know, when we started out, it was a rather rudimentary Boy Scout camp, and it's truly become a very first-class operation.
And they have a very, very strong foundation of their own that oversees the charitable fundraising for Timber Point. So that's always another level of support between us and the ultimate organization.
I want to raise a question as we begin to think in terms of taking a station break. Give our producer engineer a little time to get him ducks in a row up here. He's a busy guy. One of the things I'm going to ask Bill and David is the timeline that takes for first ask to completion of a request.
I think the shortest has been about 20 minutes.
Oh,
and
my.
the longest has probably been
Several
a
months.
year.
Yeah. Ready for a commercial, Mr. Ash?